That's rather effusive. I don't know what I would do if my dad wrote me a letter like that. I mean, on the one hand, he certainly cares about her and goes to great lengths to let her know it, but it's a weird uncategorized oddness, because it isn't as though he is being sexual about things. It isn't as though he's creating some kind of fantasy world with her. He just seems way too devoted to their bond. And to say, I really love Pammy, that's his youngest daughter, but I love her because she's your sister and you love her, so from that comes the wellspring of my love. What an oddball thing for a father to say. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is True Denise, and today we are going to be doing 2 chapters from the Mountbattens, and I'm really excited because I love this book, and I love that there are so many of you who are enjoying it with me. For those of you who are still on the Omid Scobie journey with me, thank you so much for your patience. I, like you, am not finding that book to be super interesting, so I can't wait for us to finish skimming through that, and when I say skim, I mean skim. This is going to be sort of like the Jada Pinkett Smith situation when we just kind of like hit the high notes. So we're going to be doing that with the Omid Scobie book. But today we get to read a book where we get to relish every single page, and we learn so many things that we just had no idea about. For example, this first chapter that we're going to read is called Love and Marriage. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about Dickie's relationship with his eldest daughter, which is very strange. I think the thing is, too, is it's strange in a way that you can't quite pinpoint. You can't quite describe what is off about it, because he is very loving to his daughter, and nothing is suggested that it went into realms that were criminal, but it seems like a very effusive way to speak to your daughter in this very lengthy letter we're going to be reading today, and the fact that their relationship was one that created a lot of jealousy with Edwina. His eldest daughter really replaced his wife, and not in every respect, thank the Lord for that, but in the respect of cherishing and loving her and saying that she was the most important woman in his life. So, a lot to talk about there. And then the second chapter we're going to talk about is called Poisoned Chalice. So that chapter is really interesting and very intriguing, because we're going to talk about how Dickie is now the Viceroy of India, and he has just crawled into a viper's nest. And the political situation is so intense that he very seriously did not know if he would come back alive from that appointment. And what he had gone into thinking that he wasn't going to have enough time to accomplish, found out that it was too long a time and that he really needed to speed things up. But the tensions were such that he could please no one, and everyone was angry at him, and there was no solutions for anything. The only thing that anybody in India could agree with was get the British out of here. But as far as a sustainable situation between all the different religious factions, it just seemed like there was absolutely no solution, and all the different factions had to be right, had to be the ones in charge, were very fanatical about their need to reign and rule, but there wasn't a lot of compromise that anyone was willing to give. So Dickie really is in for it on that one. And there's a lot of people who didn't necessarily like that he was appointed to that position. People that were in India felt that he was yet again trying to climb the aristocratic ladder. And they felt like he acted to everybody like, oh, this was an appointment that I wanted. I really wanted to join the Navy. But a lot of people behind the scenes knew very well that this was a position that he'd been gunning for, which is why he had befriended Nehru so seriously back in the day. So, the last chapter that we read, we talked about his relationship and him meeting Nehru, and some people said that they felt that he really cultivated that relationship to then aid him when he became Viceroy. So, we're going to talk about all that. There's so much to get into that we just have to plow ahead. All right, Chapter 16, Love and Marriage. The book says that in the summer of 1946, the Mountbattens returned to London for leave. They were feted in Paris, where Dickie was invested with the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor. And then he goes on to collect a whole host of other awards as well. In fact, so honored was he that St. Andrews even asked him to be rector, although he very wisely declined. Further happy news was engagement in July 1946 of Patricia to one of Dicky's ADCs, John, the 7th Lord Brabourne. Now, John Brabourne had been educated at Eton and Oxford and joined the Coldstream Guards at age 17. He had fought in France, been one of the extras in the film In Which We Serve, before becoming an ADC to the 1st General William Slim and then Mountbatten. It's in Delhi, where Patricia had been posted with the Wrens in 1943, that she had met her future husband. He had proposed several times until she finally accepted, but even then she had her doubts. And she had reservations, not surprisingly, because her parents' marriage had been so fraught with difficulties, and she'd had a front row seat to all of that. And as we're going to talk about extensively in the rest of this chapter, she and Dicky were very close. She and Dicky talked all the time, and so she understood what it was her father had been suffering being married to Edwina. She knew very intimately all the pains and happinesses and the valleys and the sorrows of being married. But it just seemed like it was a lot to try to take on, and she wasn't sure if that was something she wanted. She writes, "Subsequently, I suppose I was worried by the fact that my parents had had a difficult marriage for many years, and I did not want the same thing to happen to me," she later explained. "I desperately wanted a marriage that would last, and I certainly did not want to get married thinking if it didn't work out, we'd simply get divorced, which is what happens a lot of the time now." She told her father about her reservations, that she cared for Brabourne, but she was not madly in love with him. Mountbatten advised her to see it through, and they remained married until Brabourne died in 2005, so it did work out. But there was another complicating factor. The relationship between father and daughter was intense, and it would have been difficult for any man to seek to replace it. John Barrett, Mountbatten's secretary, was later to describe how Mountbatten's feelings towards her verged on, quote, the unhealthy, and that he worshipped his daughter. Patricia had early on taken the place of Edwina in his affections. Edwina found it difficult because of her own childhood to bond or communicate with her children, and would often walk straight past the nursery door at night. Dicky was always there chatting about the day's events or their problems or reading Emil and the detectives or the Barbara books in French, especially to his eldest daughter. His easy relationship with his children only further stimulated Edwina's jealous nature. As a result, there's often had to be a furtive relationship hidden from his wife, which is so weird. I mean, because on the one hand, you can see how a relationship with his children would have developed very easily and become very deeply attached, given the fact that he couldn't have a very deep relationship with his wife because she was always holding him at arm's length. So for him to have developed such a strong bond with his children is completely natural, but it becomes unnatural when he had to hide that depth of feeling from his wife. So deep was her jealousy of their relationship. It's very strange. One of the things I think that can happen when people have kids is that they actually figure out what unconditional love is. And kids are really easy to love unconditionally. They're just these little infants. They are so needy and they need you. And there's just this bond that you have with your child where you would do anything for them. And you're able to serve them in a way that you've never been able to serve anybody in your whole life. And you're able to keep doing and keep going for them in a way that you've never gone for anybody. Well, for Edwina to have seen Dicky pour his everything into them, and perhaps he wasn't always able to love Edwina with that same unconditional love because she was prickly and difficult to get along with and had to have her own way so many times. She could be a tough taskmistress. As much as Dicky framed that as a good thing, sometimes it's hard to be criticized all the time. And so I'm sure that this display of unconditional love towards the children that she was not experiencing did create jealousy for her. But it's just unfortunate that she wasn't able to step into it and think, he has something with the kids that I don't have. Let me not stand back here being jealous and angry. Let me see how I can create that too. I don't come by it as naturally, but they have something. And instead, they were forced to drive this relationship into secretive and furtive places, which I think that's when things start to get very unhealthy and very odd. Mountbatten wrote Patricia a letter on New Year's Eve, a few years later, that encapsulates the intensity of his emotions for her. It says, "It is close on midnight. Most people are out at parties, but I've just finished work and my mind, as always, turns to you. You yourself know pretty well all that you have meant to me for the past 30 years, for I have never disguised my feeling from you, but in the years to come, after Mummy and I have both passed on, as the euphemistic term goes, I would have liked to feel that there was some record in the bottom of your black box of the part you play in my life. I have sometimes regretted that you turned into such a very lovely and attractive woman, because I would certainly have loved you just as much, and very possibly more, if you had remained the ungainly, lanky creature with odd teeth and slightly receding chin that you presented when you first went to school. Physical attraction, by no means unknown to Freud between parents and children, has hardly ever entered into our very remarkable friendship. The attraction which you have had for me from the day I first met you in April 1924 was an almost mystical feeling that you were really a part of me living on in the world. I wanted a boy, not a girl, as you well know, but I am certain if you had a brother, he would never have taken your place, because from the day I saw you first as a 2-month-old baby and was allowed to help with you, I have never really had eyes for anyone else. You know how basically fond I am, and always have been, of Mummy. Basically fond. You know pretty well about my girlfriends, but none of them have had the magic something which you have. Of course, the miracle of our relationship is that you make me feel truly unselfish and wanting only your happiness. Why else should I have done so much to introduce you to Mary John when you were wavering? I have grown so fond of Pammy. Few fathers could be fonder of a daughter or miss her more than I miss Pammy now, but the mainspring of my love is that she is your sister, and you love her. Every achievement in life since 1924 has been achieved for you, and because of you. If in years to come history takes the view that I did well in my jobs, the credit must all go to you. There is always one woman in a man's life, and darling, she is you. Bless you always. You'll never really know how much I love you. That's rather effusive. I don't know what I would do if my dad wrote me a letter like that. I mean, on the one hand, he certainly cares about her and goes to great lengths to let her know it, but it's a weird uncategorized oddness, because it isn't as though he is being sexual about things. It isn't as though he's creating some kind of fantasy world with her. He just seems way too devoted to their bond. And to say, I really love Pammy, that's his youngest daughter, but I love her because she's your sister and you love her, so from that comes the wellspring of my love. What an oddball thing for a father to say. And to say, if I have any success in life, it's because I've just done it to you. You were a credit to me. Like, that's something that a husband would say to his wife, not to his daughter. It's a very, very strange letter. And again, I think it's all the weirder because I don't know that I've really seen that before. You either see detached parents, parents who love correctly, twisted parents who have developed a strange, inappropriate affection or love for a child. But this is very well described as worship of his daughter. And I don't know really where that came about, because I mean, he was gone so much of her life for so many different events. And he did see her when he was able to, but he had a wife, he had many girlfriends, he had lots of friends. It's weird to me that he developed such an intense affection for his daughter, who doesn't seem like she played a hugely prominent role in his life, unless I'm just sort of glossing over how much time they did spend together. Anyway, we're going to move on to their marriage. I guess he's been able to get past the fact that she now is going to belong to another man. Their wedding was organized to military precision, not surprisingly, because Mountbatten is the one who organized it. The book says that they were married in Romsey Abbey in October with Princess Elizabeth and Margaret as bridesmaids. Philip was an usher, the Archbishop of Canterbury officiating, and various members of the royal family were in attendance. The only hiccup was when the bridegroom was temporarily refused entry as he had not been issued a ticket. As always, Mountbatten organized it like a military operation with a special train from London that served lunch, committees to handle the traffic arrangements for almost 400 close friends and relations invited to the wedding breakfast at Broadlands. Part of it was still being used as a hospital, plus the 600 at the reception in Romsey. Now, the book wants to discuss how Mountbatten was not only over here arranging the wedding for his much-loved daughter, to John, but also he's playing a significant role in the relationship between Queen Elizabeth and Philip. So at this point, she's Princess Elizabeth. But Philip had caught the family's eye, and certainly Mountbatten wanted to push his nephew into the limelight. It was at the wedding where Princess Elizabeth's closeness to Philip became clear when a newsreel shot caught a tender glance between the two. Mountbatten had long encouraged the relationship between his nephew and his cousin's daughter. In July 1939, when the royal yacht cruised along the south coast and dropped anchor at Dartmouth, it was Mountbatten who had arranged for his nephew, then an 18-year-old cadet at the Naval College, to escort the royal party and join them for tea the next day. When the yacht departed, escorted by a collection of sailing, rowing, and motorboats, the last to obey the signal to turn back was a young, solitary rower, Philip. He was to be a regular guest at Broadlands throughout the war. He had many girlfriends, and he would bring his girlfriend of the moment with him. At that time, it was Ursula Benning, a beautiful Canadian-born debutante who was sharing a cottage with Dickie's goddaughter, Sarah Norton, while still working in a wartime aircraft factory and later in the naval section at Bletchley. It was Mountbatten who had asked Sarah, daughter of Jean Norton, to matchmake for the young prince. But not everybody was on board for this little matchmaking session. Some people thought that they were entirely too closely related for this sort of bond. The conservative MP Chips Channon had noted in his diary in January 1941, "He is to be our prince consort, and that is why he's serving in our navy. But I deplore such a marriage. He and Princess Elizabeth are too interrelated." 3 years later, Dickie was writing to the king. "Personally, I hope you can persuade him to stay in your navy and not go mixing himself up in Greek affairs. He can't even talk Greek, and his outlook and training are entirely English. I don't believe Greece will remain a monarchy for long. They never have. And an exiled Greek prince is a sorry sort of job. Look what it did to Andrea. Particularly for an outstanding young man like Philip. He's happy in the Royal Navy and can easily rise to the top on merit, as my father did." One of the reasons Dickie was keen that his nephew should serve in the Royal Navy was to help anglicize him. The plotting and romance continued. In April 1944, Philip was taking soundings from family members on whether he should propose. The following month, after Dickie and Edwina had dined with George VI, Mountbatten wrote, "I think your plan of going ahead now with Philip's British nationality and permanent commission in the Royal Navy excellent from every point of view, as it leaves the question of Lilibet open." Side note, isn't that interesting he would call her Lilibet? I thought only intimate family members called her that, like her father alone. So I was wrong about that. Anyway, he goes on to say that I've drafted out a paper, which I enclose, and from which I suggest you redraft a paper of your own. Will you please let me have a copy of the final paper and decision before I go so that I can talk to Georgie about this in Cairo and Philip in Ceylon when I leave in a week's time? I take it that the First Lord, as well as Foreign Secretary and PM, will have to be consulted. But here's the thing. So they're trying to rush his nationality so that the question of him becoming engaged to Elizabeth will be less galling to those around him. But the king is a little bit concerned that Mountbatten has once again got an idea in his head and is going to continue to push, regardless of what everybody else wants. As soon as he gets a plan in his head, you know how he is. He just wants to go straight for it. And he wants to sort of push everybody along, whether they're ready or not. And so the book says that the king was getting cold feet. He said, "I've been thinking the matter over since our talk, and I've come to the conclusion that we're going too fast." He felt the schemer should concentrate simply on nationality for the moment. "I'm sure this is the best way of doing this particular operation, don't you? Though I know you like to get things settled at once you have an idea in mind." Mountbatten continued to push, writing to the king later that month after he had seen Philip in Cairo and he had signed the application for British nationality and revocation to the throne of Greece. Thus the preliminary steps had all been taken and only the legal formalities now remained to be completed. "I am quite sure that all this must be thorough and completed before the armistice with Germany to ensure the minimal publicity and best reception. But I am not trying to hurry you this time," says Mountbatten. Mountbatten goes off to write to his mother and says, "Yeah, we are trying to get his nationality in order, but it's not because we're trying to rush him down the aisle with Elizabeth. We're not plotting and scheming or anything like that." Please. Dickie does enjoy playing matchmaker, but what of his own marriage? The Mountbatten marriage dynamics had now returned to their pre-war position, with Dickie as busy as ever, but Edwina searching to fill her time. Not surprisingly, because she had so much to do during the war that I can imagine it's completely anticlimactic to come home to your big house with nothing to do. And you aren't the same person you were before the war, so you can't just fall back on your old ways. The book says she'd outgrown her pre-war friends in life and had no role nor close intimates. Bunny was married, and her friend Jean Norton, one of her closest friends, had died unexpectedly in the spring of 1945. Into the vacuum came a new lover. So she starts seeing this conductor. His name is Malcolm Sargent in the 1930s. Malcolm was funny and quick-witted, always immaculately turned out, big ladies' man. Everybody thought he was the bee's knees. And he was a public figure because he had an appearance on the BBC's The Brains Trust, which was a show where a panel of guests answered questions put by the listeners. He was the conductor of the London Philharmonic, and he had made a tour of 10 cities, the Blitz Tour. And it was at one of these concerts at the Albert Hall in January 1941 that Edwina had met him again. Sargent, unhappily married and mourning his daughter, who had died at age 18 in 1944, had a penchant for society women, and the two lonely souls became occasional lovers. But he also was a person who was socially well connected, and so through him she could begin some of her work again by helping him to raise money for his charities. And he, in turn, provided the emotional support that Dickey, focused on his own activities, not least writing his report at his time as Supreme Allied Commander, could not always give her. Dickey was now all set to resume his naval career. In the new year, he was due to start the Senior Officers Technical Course at Portsmouth in preparation for a new posting to Malta. Arrangements were being made to rent a house, when in December, shortly after being admitted to the Order of the Garter, he was summoned to Downing Street with the offer of a new job, the most important of his whole career. And a terrible one, because this is the job where he is now going to be thrown into an absolute viper's nest. So we're going into Chapter 17. Chapter 17 is called A Poisoned Chalice, and a better title he could not have chosen. The book says that on December 17th, George VI wrote in his diary amidst concerns about the current Viceroy of India, Wavell. He said, "The PM is wondering who to send there as Viceroy instead, and suggested Dickey, who he said has tact and gets on well with people. I told Attlee that Dickey must have concrete orders as to what he is to do. Is he to lead the retreat out of India, or is he to work for the reconciliation of Hindus and Muslims?" Indian self-rule had been promised by the British government since 1917, but it had been slow to come. The Government of India Act 1935 had increased the number of voters to 35 million and created 11 British Indian provinces with limited autonomy as the first step towards a federal India, to include the 565 princely states who owed their allegiance to the British Crown. The plan had always been for a united subcontinent, but from 1936 a sectarian element entered the equation. The leader of the All-Indian Muslim League, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, once a believer in Muslim cooperation with Congress, began to argue for a separate Muslim nation to ensure the protection of the Muslim minority. The new state of Pakistan would be made up of 5 Muslim-majority provinces. The Second World War further complicated matters. Congress, taking advantage of the British vulnerability, decided that it would not support the British war effort, withdrew its representatives from the 11 provincial governments, and mounted a campaign of civil disobedience. Into the vacuum stepped Jinnah's Muslims, who agreed to support the British war effort, thereby consolidating the Muslim League's position at the expense of Congress. In the summer of 1945, Labour came to power, determined to withdraw from India. The following March, a cabinet mission arrived against the backdrop of recent elections where Congress had won seats in the largely Hindu provinces and the Muslim League had taken seats in Muslim areas. It proposed a federal India, but with powers at the center covered defense, foreign affairs, communications, and the currency. Accepted by the Muslim League, it was rejected by the Congress Party. On August 16, 1946, the Muslim League had called for a direct action day to protest against Hindu refusal to accept a federation. The 4 days of communal rioting that followed led to 20,000 deaths or serious injuries in Calcutta alone, and revealed the inability of the British administration to keep order and the impossibility of a united India. So into that chaos, Mountbatten is now being sent. The sad thing is that the Viceroy in charge at that time, Wavell, didn't even realize that they were looking for a replacement. So what's already a difficult situation is now compounded by the awkwardness of showing up and being like, "Oh, hey man, I have your job now." Still, given the fact that Wavell wasn't aware that his replacement was impending, he and Mountbatten were in communications, and he wrote Mountbatten and said, "I have tried everything I know to solve the problem of handing over India to its people, and I can see no light. I have only one solution, which I call Operation Madhouse, withdrawal of the British province by province, beginning with women and children, then civilians, and then the army. Without another 4 or 5 divisions, he told the cabinet, he could not hold India for much longer. He envisaged withdrawing by March 1948. Wavell was tired and could make no progress, John Christie, Wavell's private secretary, later noted. He had maintained the political dialogue, but he lacked the flair, the zest, and perhaps the imagination to break the deadlock. It was against this backdrop that the decision to replace Wavell was taken with a new face in policy. Mountbatten had first been mooted in 1943 as one of the 4 possible candidates: Anthony Eden, R.A. Butler, and Archibald Wavell. Winston wouldn't have R.A.B. because he said, in rather coarse language, that he didn't have the right appearance to carry off the position of Viceroy. Julian Amory told Mountbatten, "Your name was certainly considered, but my father told me that it had been decided that you were to go to another job of the greatest importance in the war." But by January 1946, Mountbatten was again suggested, this time by the former Viceroy Lady Willingdon and also Stafford Cripps, probably at the suggestion of the Secretary of the India League in London, Krishna Menon. Mountbatten had several obvious attractions. His royal connections would appeal to the princes, and he had already established a good relationship with Nehru. He was young, dynamic, imaginative, charming, apolitical, had knowledge of India from his time at SEAC, looked the part, and his pragmatic and liberal policies dealing with the nationalistic risings in Southeast Asia appealed to Attlee. The Prime Minister wrote in his memoirs, he had imagination, sympathy, and tremendous drive. I knew also that he had, in Lady Mountbatten, a wife who would admirably assist him. How did Dickie feel about all this? I mean, he's being shoved towards what would seem a nightmare from any angle. Doesn't look like there's anywhere to go in any of this that seems like there's a pocket of peace. Mountbatten, the book says, was keen to resume his naval career and was worried that a further delay in resuming it would put an end to it, and felt that he was being handed, after SEAC, another poisoned chalice. Edwina wanted to concentrate on her relief work and on restoring Classybon, a home on the west coast of Ireland that she had inherited from her father, and she had no wish to be separated from family and friends again. She had had a partial hysterectomy at the end of February that left her suffering from neuralgia, which was exacerbated by plane flights. Her diary often had comments such as, "feeling like death." So, the way Mountbatten felt was, I just got back from SEAC. And we discussed in the last episode, that seemed like the most arduous task ever, especially once the war was over. So the whole time the war was going on, he's trying to get everybody happy, everybody on the same page. But of course, the Allies have their objectives, and he's got his own. Then it's over, and he's supposed to settle all the political disputes, figure out the economy, put people in power. I mean, it just seemed like a whole nother war, but a different kind of war. Maybe like one that's even harder to fight because you can't just leave destruction in your wake. With a war, just get the job done, doesn't matter how it's done, more or less. But when you have been left in the rubble to pick up the place and to put in a functioning government, I mean, I said it last time, I would rather set myself on fire and jump off a cliff. That just seems horrific. So to have come from that job and now to be sent into yet, like I said, another viper's nest, just, it's like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? My wife doesn't even want to come with me. She's got all of her health problems. She's ready to be home again. Must I? Now, that's what he says. But the book is going to expose the fact that there's quite a few people in India, once he actually gets there, who felt like that was all a story that he told to make it seem like, I protested. I am the indispensable man. So I came to serve my country. Heavy is my lot in life, but I'll do anything for old England. Anyway, the reluctance allowed Mountbatten to lay down a series of conditions. Now, he bragged later on about all the things that he said, I will do it on these conditions, and that he basically had everybody hopping and that he was just pulling a bunch of strings. But some say that there weren't quite as many claims as he made, but he still had quite a few. 4 of the main criteria was that he said his naval career could not be jeopardized by this new appointment. He said that he must go on the invitation of the Indian politicians. He did not intend to be imposed upon them. He said that the present Secretary of State for India should be replaced by Billy Listowel. He said he must have continued use of the York MW-102 airplane that he had used at SEAC. And finally, so actually it's 5 points, he said he needed to be able to choose his own staff. So he comes with a bundle of things he's expecting. And it would appear that they gave it to him because he went on to select all these people who he's worked with before to come along with him for yet one more ride. Top of the list of people that you have heard us discuss, Pug Ismay came, as well as Peter Murphy to be his general advisor and speechwriter, Vernon Erskine Crumb as conference secretary, etc., etc. He has quite a few people that are listed. But as I said before, they're making plans for a new viceroy, but poor Wavell has no idea that this is happening. The book says that whilst all these negotiations were going on, Wavell had not been told by Attlee that he was to be replaced. Only on February 13th, 2 days after Mountbatten finally accepted the offer, was he informed. Sadly, and your heart goes out to him, he said, "Could we announce this in a little bit because my daughter is getting married the following week. I have 800 people coming to her wedding, and I would like to save face, and maybe you could make this announcement after the wedding," which they acquiesced to that. On February 20th, Mountbatten's appointment was announced to both houses of Parliament. But they're grim prospects, and nobody expected that this was just going to be a real slam dunk. On March 18th, the Mountbattens held a farewell cocktail party at the Royal Automobile Club. Dickie was president. And there were 700 people there, followed by a dinner with the Braeburns and Prince Philip. Noel Coward, who attended, wrote in his diary, "I wonder if they will come back alive. I think that if it is possible to make a go of it in the circumstances, they will, but I have some forebodings." It was a concern Mountbatten himself shared. He wrote, "We shall be incredibly unpopular, and the odds are we shall end up with bullets in our backs." A poisoned chalice indeed, may I say. To have made it through World War II, only to be stuck in what is going to essentially be a mounting civil war, I just would have felt so embittered about it. Like, can I not get any peace? Is there nothing else that I can do? But I think that Mountbatten and I are very different, and I don't think that Mountbatten necessarily did want to just sit around and enjoy some peace after the war. I think he was looking for the next high. 2 days later, the Mountbattens, including Pamela, were driven to Northolt, where they were seen off by, amongst others, Prince Philip and Malcolm Sargent. Malcolm Sargent, don't forget, that is Edwina's new boyfriend, so again, these people, always with their lovers, hanging around. There were some final instructions flung at Mountbatten as he left. He was told that it is the definite objective of His Majesty's government to obtain a unitary government for British India and the Indian states, if possible within the British Commonwealth, through the medium of a constituent assembly, set up and run in accordance with the Cabinet's mission plan. The date fixed for the transfer of power is a flexible one to within 1 month, but you should aim for June 1st, 1948, at the effective date for the transfer of power. So that's a lot to try to accomplish. They had about 15 months granted to them to get this work done. And as will be stated later in the chapter, many of them thought that that wasn't going to be enough time. But when they see the furor that they have walked into, now they're frantic that that's too much time and that all will be lost if they drag their feet at all. I mean, it just seems like this looming date way in the distance, and there's just too much pressure for them to be able to wait that long. But all of that's a little ways in the distance. He hasn't started the job yet. Their reception happened on March 22nd. They arrived in Delhi and were driven to the gates of the Viceroy's house, where they transferred to an open landau and continued with a cavalry escort. Awaiting them on the steps, along with bagpipers of the Royal Scots Fusiliers, were the Wavells and a dismounted Sikh bodyguard in black and gold turbans, scarlet uniforms with white breeches, and shiny black thigh boots. It's all very regal. The first night was spent with Wavell briefing the Mountbattens. "The problems are quite horrifying," Dickie wrote to his mother the next day, "but I feel we shall find a way of surmounting them, and that Edwina will be a real help to me in this task." She quickly sought to become chatelaine of her new manor. No detail was left unexamined or unquestioned, his daughter Pamela later remembered. The timing and cost of meals, the state of the servants' quarters, the conditions of the linen and plate, the management of the house, the gardens, the stables, the school, the clinic, and I would often accompany her. As a side note, this kind of reminds me a little bit of Wallace Simpson, who made her house her all-consuming mission because she had nothing else to do. I'm not saying that Edwina is in that position. She has far more responsibility over this house than Wallace Simpson ever had. I mean, Wallace Simpson created these, dramas and dinner parties for herself, for pure personal amusement. But Edwina actually has to have dinners almost daily at her house. So she does have to really throw herself into this, but it does give her something to do where there was a vacuum. As long as she was in England and really having to sort of come up with things to do, now there's no having to come up with things. There's so much work on her plate. The house was just unbelievably grand. He describes it in great detail. The author says that it was a major undertaking to deal with everything about this house. The Viceroy house had only been completed 18 years earlier. It had 377 rooms, 1.5 miles of corridors, and occupied 5 acres. Friends, take that in. 377 rooms, 1.5 miles of corridors, and the house took over 5 acres? I can't even conceive of that. It consisted of a central block and 4 wings on 4 floors, and every sort of Indian marble and stone or variety of wood had been used. In the basement was a fully equipped cinema and theater, a modern printing press, pump room for the air conditioning machines, carpenters and electrical workshops, storerooms, and a laundry. The 4 large gardens covered a further 175 acres and included gardens in the Mongol and Italianate style, waterways, cricket grounds, a 9-hole golf course, a freshwater swimming pool, and a pack of hounds by the Royal Delhi Hunt, who were accommodated in kennels adjoining the vice-regal stables. Almost 6,000 people worked in the house or in the 4 large gardens. That's insane! To have an establishment that is that enormous, I can't even contemplate creating such a network. Just for what? Pomp and to let the people of India know who ruled over them? I mean, it's difficult to understand why it needed to be so regal. The Viceroy is an extension of the royalty of England. So I suppose you've got to give royal vibes, but they definitely knew their assignment and completed it. Now, as just a little point of color to this story, the author has included that Dickey worked from a small study with an inscription framed in leather on his desk, and the inscription said, "There are 4 kinds of officers: hardworking and intelligent, lazy and intelligent, lazy and stupid, and hardworking and stupid. The first are fit for top staff appointments, the second for the highest commands, the third can be tolerated, but the 4th type could prove dangerous and should be instantly removed." He never said which he considered himself to be. Okay, well, now he's here. He's taken over this guy's job. It's time for the swearing in. And it is captured, this picture right here, is from their swearing in. Look at this. Look at the regality. What in the world? They truly are the king and the queen in India. They are on mission, and they have to look this regal because they're supposed to be representing the crown. Not surprisingly, but the whole ceremony, the first to be filmed and photographed, had lasted 15 minutes. Within half an hour of its start, the Mountbattens had shed their finery and they were at work. Alive to the need for pomp and circumstance, they had also decided to adopt a more informal style than their predecessors. Court circulars now simply announced the people that they had seen. "It's not by words or pompous notices that one keeps up prestige of the crown in one's country," Edwina announced, "but I think by behavior and example." Now, she was not one to shirk her side of the duties, as we know. And her side of the duties really included the entertainment and the hospitality element. So every week the Mountbattens held 2 garden parties, 3 or 4 luncheons for 30, and 2 or 3 large dinner parties, each comprised of at least 50% Indians, with their dietary preferences indicated by a different colored ribbon on the back of their chair. Indians were now appointed as ADCs. Notes were kept of every meeting and circulated daily. Everybody is in the business of propping up this Viceroy appointment. But day to day, what is the situation at home? Well, the book says that there were long 18-hour days, which began at dawn when Dickie and Pamela would ride together on the ridge above Delhi with a couple of armed bodyguards, sometimes with Mountbatten practicing his polo swing along the way. His younger daughter had become his new confidant, with Patricia now married and living in the Chester Street house. Edwina was now going through the menopause, and Dickie found himself the butt of her various mood swings. Often he would spend hours in the evening trying to soothe her. My father would try to comfort her, but he just didn't know how, Pamela recalled. He was very patient with her, but he couldn't cope with the tears, and like a bull in a china shop, he always seemed to say the wrong thing and put his foot in it, when all he really wanted to do was help. Edwina had hoped for a quieter life after the war. My neuralgia has been frightful, but I still hope for the best, she confided to her diary. She told Pamela that she realized, quote, "It's a great adventure, which it is, and I love the work and my Indians and a lot of the interests, but how I long for lovely Broadlands and sweet little Chester Street and the cozy and simple life." But even though she's in a great deal of pain and misses her old life, she doesn't let it get her down to the point where she's just sort of becoming enclosed on herself. Now, she and Dickie are certainly having their rows and they can't seem to get along. That's nothing new, but I do think that maybe the viciousness and the inability to soothe her is a new element. But she's trying to keep busy. The book says that she identified women and welfare issues as an area that she would support. One of her priorities was to win the trust of influential female figures, such as Gandhi's secretary. And Pamela, meanwhile, worked 2 evenings a week in the Allied Forces canteen, but also accompanied her mother to visit schools and hospitals. Now, as I've discussed earlier, the family might have been up to all this do-goodery, but people looked at Mountbatten with a little bit of dismay, feeling like he had just manipulated his way in by pretending like it wasn't something he wanted. The book says that many Indians remained suspicious of the new viceroy. They said Mountbatten says that he was forced to accept the viceroyalty of India by His Majesty the King. There can be no bigger untruth, wrote Sahid Hamid, Sir Claude Auchinleck's private secretary, in his diary on the day of the swearing-in. It's common knowledge that he wanted it badly to enhance his political standing, and he worked towards it. He established close contact with Nehru, knowing that he would one day become the Prime Minister of India. It was the efforts of Krishna Menon which further cemented their friendship. According to common gossip, Mountbatten had come to partition India as quickly as possible, irrespective of the consequences. Sort out the princes, take all possible measures to keep the two countries in the Commonwealth, ensure that Britain's strategic and mercantile interests in South Asia are not jeopardized, and finally keep the Indian leaders under pressure and give them no time to think. Well, that is what the detractors were doing. But as far as what Mountbatten was actually trying to do, he had key advisors, and they would meet to review the previous 24 hours, and Mountbatten would use them as a sounding board for his various tactics. One of Mountbatten's priorities was to get to know and win most of the key players. Nehru and Gandhi represented the Hindu community, Sardar Patel of the Congress Party, and Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan for the Muslims. Each was invited for a one-to-one chat in his study, generally of an hour, followed by 15 minutes with a stenographer to take down the salient details. Mountbatten's first visitor was Nehru, and helped by the Singapore meeting the year before, relations were good from the start. Indeed, it was not only Dickie, but also Edwina. Oh yes, Edwina's going to hedge in here pretty good. They were instantly warmed by the lonely and charismatic widower. Hamid noted in his diary within 10 days of the Mountbatten's arrival that, quote, according to Menon, Nehru's relationship with Lady Mountbatten is sufficiently close to have raised many eyebrows. See, they're not into the idea of hiding when they're having an affair. This is foreign to them. I mean, I guess in some ways, if you're going to do the wrong thing, you might as well do it boldly. But they had never in their whole life decided that if they were going to sleep with somebody, they would hide it, not just from each other, but from the world. Oh, no, no, no. Everyone has to be part of their love. The book says that the two certainly spent much time together during the first week, and there is evidence of an immediate intimacy. Photographs of the time show her looking lovingly at him at a Red Cross meeting. At the Mountbatten's first garden party, Nehru sat cross-legged at Edwina's feet during a dance recital with too few chairs for guests, and after the party she returned to his house, unaccompanied by her husband, although she did drag her daughter along to make things look kosher, for a nightcap. This senior Congress politician, Maulana Azad, felt that while Nehru was genuinely impressed by Lord Mountbatten, perhaps an even greater was the influence of Lady Mountbatten. She's not only extremely intelligent, but had a most attractive and friendly temperament. She admired her husband greatly and in many cases tried to interpret his thoughts to those who would not at first agree with him. As a side note, these two are just the weirdest team to me. Dickie and Edwina, I can't imagine it going so well for any other couple. This is an anomaly if ever I've seen one. What is the deal with them marching into a new country and being like, okay, I've got this job, you've got this job, and if you can manage to strike up a new affair with Nehru, that would really help me out. What is this Abraham/Sarah going into Egypt scenario? All right, well, Nehru also made an immediate impression, not least on Pamela. So, Pamela has had to, her entire life, make room in her heart, her mind, and in her very soul for all these intruders who continue to lull up into her parents' life. Dickie has had his many girlfriends, but so has her mother, with Bunny being the most prominent member of the little cozy family. But Nehru makes a good impression on Pamela. Probably she already knew she better figure out how she felt about him since he was going to be hanging around quite a bit. But she says that he was not only was she impressed by his beautiful speaking voice and impeccable dress, a white button-down tunic with the famous Nehru collar, jodhpurs, and a rosebud in his buttonhole, but also by his warmth and charm, which enveloped me, says Pamela, from our first handshake. She said, watching him interact with others, I could see that he reacted to things instantly, was quick to laugh or make you laugh, and always interested in what you had to say. I realized that both Gandhi and Nehru were the most extraordinary people I had ever met. It is interesting how many people she just has hobnobbed with in her young life, and it's just no thing. On March 31st, it was Gandhi's turn. Though he held little political power, he was an important influencer. His calculated gesture of putting his hand on Edwina's shoulder to steady himself sent a signal to India and the world that this was a couple with whom he could do business. But it wasn't all wins and camaraderie, so don't think that just because Nehru and Gandhi were chummy with the Mountbattens that everybody was. Hardly. The Mountbattens found it difficult to establish any sort of personal rapport with the austere and intransigent Jinnah, who they did not meet until April 5th, and then made a point of seeing every day until April the 10th. Dickie, never sure whether Jinnah's demand for 5 Muslim provinces was a negotiating play or a non-negotiable, was to call him at various times a, quote, bastard, a dolt, a clot, a psychopathic and hopeless case, a one-man band, an evil genius, a fool, and a cold, repressed person. Edwina encountered the same problem when she met with Jinnah's sister in late April. She seemed almost fanatical at times, says Edwina. Like Mr. Jinnah, she has, of course, a persecution mania and is obviously convinced that the Hindu intends to subjugate and dominate the Muslims completely. So the Jinnah was a little bit more intense about his religious convictions. Remember, we've got the Hindus, we've got the Muslims, the Sikhs. There's just a lot going on here. And all of them feel like that to compromise it all, to find a solution that accommodated another religion would be to dismiss their own. So we're just having a lot of difficulties here. It quickly became clear that Jinnah would not accept the cabinet mission plan and that transferring power in June 1948 would be too late. The situation is everywhere electric, and I get the feeling that the mine may go up at any moment, wrote Esme to his wife Derry within days of his arrival. It's not reason or logic that is at the back of it all, but sheer emotionalism, and emotionalism is the hardest thing to contend with. There's very little anti-British feeling, but the intercommunal hatred is a devouring flame. In the Punjab, governor's rule has been imposed by Sir Evan Jenkins after Hindus and Sikhs had refused to cooperate with the Muslim League. There was also violence in the northwest frontier province, where direct rule was also being considered by the governor, Sir Olaf Carrow. But things are truly reaching their fever point. Esme wrote in his memoirs, I had thought before I left England that a period of 15 months was far too short a time in which to complete arrangements for the transfer of power. But I had not been 3 weeks in India before I was convinced that so far from being too short, it was too long. The principal reason for this change of mind was the realization that communal bitterness had grown to incredible proportions since I was last in India. He quickly realized that with independence and partition, the police could no longer be relied on to operate a non-sectarian manner. Without a dispassionate police force, there was little hope of keeping order except through the British Army. Indian political intelligence was also now run by an Indian, who would not share it with the new Viceroy. It's so terribly complicated, because they knew, just like everybody else, that they needed to get out of India. And they had been promising to do it for a long time. This is just such a long, protracted situation. But there's other reasons why he feels like they need to get out as well. Not just because the police force has turned against them and they can't get any intelligence, but Ismay says that we cannot continue to bear responsibility until June 1948 because the administration of this country is going to the dogs. Apparently, there had been no recruitment in the Indian civil service since the beginning of the war, and numbers had fallen from the peak of 1,000 to under 500. The coalition government was divided on communal lines and refused to work together. The Muslim League was in charge of finance and rejected every proposal put forward by the Congress members of the Executive Council. The only point on which there was agreement, Ismay noted, was that the British should quit India as soon as possible. I'm sure everybody was in agreement to that because this book goes on to detail what sounds like a literally hellacious scenario. Ismay goes on to say that they were torn with suspicions of each other and of the British. They had read sinister motives into the most innocent proposals. They worked themselves into ungovernable rages with anyone who disagreed with them. They did not hesitate to wreck any plan that was not in entire accord with their own desires, but admitted no responsibility for finding any practical alternative. Mountbatten said, "The scene here is one of unrelieved gloom." He reported to Attlee on April 1st that the country is in a most unsettled state. There are communal riots and troubles in the Punjab, the northwest frontier province, Bihar, Calcutta, Bombay, and even here in Delhi. In the Punjab, all parties are seriously prepared for civil war. And of these, by far the most businesslike are the Sikhs. I am convinced that a fairly quick decision would appear to be the only way to convert the Indian minds from their present emotionalism to stark realism and to counter the disastrous spread of strife. The final sentence is that to the Queen, the same day, Mountbatten concluded that unless I act quickly, I may well find the real beginnings of a civil war on my hands. And that is the end of that chapter today. Whew! Oh, goodness. Next chapter is called A Tryst with Destiny. They just keep getting better and better. But did you guys enjoy that today? I thought that those two chapters were really intriguing and incredibly interesting. Not just because we're reading about Dickie's career, but I really found the information about his relationship with his wife and his daughters, the fact that Edwina is being snappy and difficult with him because of menopause and because of her hysterectomy and her neuralgia, but she seems like she has all this time to find a fresh source of energy for Nehru. If I was Dickie, one of the things I would be the most embittered about would be the fact that she seems to have an untapped well of strength for everybody but them. And we talked about this in the last episode, so I won't belabor the point. But it just would be so frustrating to me to think, you can't stand me. Everything I do drives you crazy. You act so tired and worn out with me. You're so weary. You keep writing about that in your diary. And yet, you have time for drinks with Nehru at the drop of a hat. I don't know, you guys. I wouldn't love it. So I'm excited to see what next week will bring us. I hope you're enjoying our Sunday special. This week, we will continue on with the Omid Scobie book. But like I said, we're skimming that book. We are not going to sit there and marinate and parse out every sentence because it isn't worth our time. And it's also such poor writing, I just can't. My brain is melting with every page that I read from that book. So I just want to kind of hit the high notes and his worst complaints, because this week I have other books coming in, so we should be planning on working that in. But I hate to not finish a book, but I also know that some books just aren't worthy of our full attention for every page, and Omid Scobie's book is definitely one that is just filling some space. Hope you had a wonderful 4th of July, and I hope that this weekend was restful and enjoyable to you. And to those in England, I understand you had your elections, so I hope those went the way you wanted them to. depending on where you sit in your politics. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.